My relationship started in 2006, meeting Alison at an NHS meeting. And since then, what emphasis here and today is to show you that we work together, the pathology, the cardiology, and genetics as well, cardiac genetics. Working very closely here, sponsored by CRY at St. George's. As you know, the heart is a magnificent pump, and most of the causes of sudden death, cardiac death, are in the heart. It's a pump magnificently designed to pump blood around the body. It weighs between 200 and 425. The size of your heart is the size of your fist in your chest. Remember that. And by the end of a life of 70 years, a person's heart has beaten more than 3.5 billion times. It's a magnificent organ. And each day, the average heart beats 100,000 times, pumping 7,500 litres of blood. So it's called on to do an awful lot for us. In addition to the muscle, it has to be supplied with oxygen. So the coronary arteries are very important. And they are highly efficient in delivering oxygen to this very demanding muscle. And as I'm sure you're all aware, the majority of sudden deaths in older people are blocked coronary arteries due to atheroma, which everybody is very familiar. We are dealing mainly with younger deaths, genetic causes, sudden adult death, and cardiomyopathies. The electrical activity. As a pathologist, I can look at the heart, but I cannot see the electrical activity, the areas of what we call the conduction tissue, conducting the electrical impulse. And my cardiological colleagues following me will talk more about that. We look at the heart to see if there are any abnormalities within it. That is our most important job as cardiac pathologists. And how I got involved was with Tim Boker, who's on the board of CRY, with my mentor, Mike Davis, who taught me cardiac pathology in the 90s. And we produced one of the first surveys of sudden, unexpected cardiac death in the United Kingdom, a true national survey. And Mike Davis was a pioneer in looking into the causes of sudden cardiac death. He tragically died prematurely in 2003. And it was the first paper, really, to emphasize the entity of sudden adult death or sudden arrhythmic death. Because up to then, most people believed you died of coronary artery disease. The majority. We found no, a significant number of sudden unexpected deaths, 7%. The pathologist found nothing. Nothing. So how could a pathologist go back and say to a family, I found nothing? And Mike Davis predicted in that paper that we are going to find the causes. And ye, the fellows and the clinicians and cardiologists, have now begun to expand our knowledge of these causes. So this paper was seminal in telling pathologists, when you find a sudden death, young person, heart is normal, toxicology is negative, you have to do further investigations. You cannot simply leave it unexplained or unascertained. And as I say, I met Alison during this chapter, coronary heart disease, in the NHS framework. Chapter 8 was arrhythmias and sudden death in 2005. And at the same time, and in 2015, I co-wrote the guidelines helping pathologists when there is a possible cardiac cause of sudden death. And these were important as guidelines to us here in the United Kingdom as to what we as pathologists and what cardiologists should do in the investigation of sudden death. And I'm sure many of you in the audience are aware of the Sebastian and Howard English. Sebastian died playing rugby age 15, 11 years after his father, Howard, died in exact similar circumstances playing rugby in Esher. CRY patrons Simon Halliday and John Inverdale both knew Howard English and witnessed his actual collapse. So they started fundraising. And why they fundraised for cardiac pathology was because I made a diagnosis. In Sebastian's heart was sent to me for examination, and we diagnosed arrhythmogenic right ventricular cardiomyopathy, what was called dysplasia at the time. It was a new disease for pathologists. Believe it or not, the majority of pathologists did not at the time know what arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy was. And then when we reviewed Howard's post-mortem from 11 years before, we found the disease in his father. So if the father had been diagnosed, we had known this entity 11 years before, maybe something could have been done for Sebastian. And what was important is Howard's 84-year-old mother had the same mutant gene, yet she was alive. And then her 2 remaining children could be screened and were found to be negative. So the benefits of a specific cardiac pathology diagnosis is vital to the clinical and the genetic investigation of the families. So if you have not got a right diagnosis or a misdiagnosis or no diagnosis, where does the cardiologist begin to screen? So having a very precise diagnosis by examining the heart and examining it very carefully with genetic testing and clinical screening. And here, you can see here a youthful Sanjay, also involved in the fundraising with Alison and Simon Halliday, who raised the money to establish the cardiac pathology, CRY cardiac pathology unit. And they raised 180,000 to give me a research scientist, a PhD student, a medical secretary, because there's an enormous amount of documentation involved in this, with a microscope and laboratory facilities. So I was extremely grateful in 2008 to get this donation and establish. And the CRY Centre of Cardiac Pathology has premises, has got equipment, has got staff. We take a piece of spleen for genetics. Importantly, we give a report once we receive the heart and the actual clinical investigation. We give a report to the coroner within 2 weeks. We guarantee that. So there's a rapid turnaround to provide the cause of death, and we will fast track for all the cases that come to our department. I'll quickly go briefly. This is all the bookwork because of the fact of consent, and we want to know what the family's wishes are concerning the heart, the tissues, and the genetic testing as well. This is very important that the coroner's officer in particular, who's in immediate contact with the family when there's a tragic event occurring. So having this paperwork looks very daunting, but with the help of the coroner and coroner's officer, we're able to communicate with most families and get consent for research. We cannot do any research without you, family's consent. So that's why we need secretarial help. All this bookwork, all this consent, all this paperwork has to be filled in by us and by the coroner's officers. This is the equipment, and I'm delighted to say that in 2013-14, we moved from the Royal Brompton Hospital, where I originally worked, to St. George's, and opened up the unit. And you can see here Alison, right, and also with our coroners and also with members of Parliament, members of the House of Lords. In other words, getting politicians on our side, which I'm sure Steve and Alison would talk to you about. We established a unit here. And why did we come to George's? Because of my close links to the cardiologists, both Sanjay and Elijah Baer, and also Michael Papadakis and the fellows, because they were doing the clinical screening, as already said by Steve, the Inherited Cardiac Centre. Pathology working together with the cardiologists, a vital link. And by coming here, we really established a powerhouse in the investigation of sudden cardiac death. And going on from that, CRY continues to fund our department here since 2014. And we've gone on from strength to strength. And here, as all my staff, and in the audience is Joe Westerby, my research fellow. And we've built up to be the largest pathology unit in the world dealing with sudden cardiac death, not just in the United Kingdom, but in the world. Now, we're now world leaders in research in this area. We have set up a database, again with CRY funding, and this database is invaluable for us and for the cardiologists investigating the family, giving all the details of the case, the previous family history, ECGs, any imaging. All this is vitally important for the cardiologists who will be screening the family. In addition, what's vital is our role in talking to other pathologists throughout the United Kingdom, both general pathologists, pediatric, because children die, other cardiac pathologists. In other words, exchange information and learn from each other, as we all do, and also with our fellows. And we work with pathologists around the microscope discussing difficult cases on a regular basis, because we get quite challenging cases, and it's vital to interact with other pathologists throughout the country. We get from throughout the whole United Kingdom, Further work that has led on from this has emphasised, which I'm sure you all are aware, sudden adult death. The majority of who die suddenly are male. Young males predominate compared to females, and the majority of the causes, as you can see there, 59% in blue, are sudden adult death. The heart is absolutely normal. So the majority of our sudden deaths are sudden arrhythmic deaths. The second most common cause here in the red-brown, 24% a quarter, are cardiomyopathies, intrinsic muscle diseases of the heart. And these, as you know, are mainly genetic, just like sudden adult death is mainly genetic. And here you can see cardiomyopathies and SADs, sudden adult death, make up the majority of our cases, and these are genetic, so family screening is vital. And since then, we have gone up from an original 700 cases, we have gone up to 6,000 cases. It's the largest pathology cardiac database in the world. And what we have found, reflecting already from our initial studies, the majority, 44%, nearly half, are sudden adult death. Right? The channelopathies, which will be spoken about. Ischemic heart disease, coronary artery disease, still figures among sudden deaths. We must always consider it. Then you have idiopathic left ventricular hypertrophy, HCM, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy, and dilated cardiomyopathy. These are all different types of cardiomyopathies which have a largely genetic component. We are now getting our research into very high-powered journals, and these are some of the examples which will be spoken about by my other colleagues. So multiple papers coming from this database because we've been able to coalesce all the expertise, allowing us to publish in high-impact journals. Now, the different types of cardiomyopathies. You have hypertrophic, where the heart is too thick. You have too much muscle in the heart. Dilated is where the heart is too weak. It dilates and the muscle weakens. And finally, you have arrhythmogenic, which I already mentioned, which is the most newest type of cardiomyopathy we've diagnosed, and it's where fat infiltrates the muscle of the heart. All these have a strong genetic component, and a specific diagnosis must be made in each of these cases. 4% of our cases are dilated cardiomyopathy, so quite a small percentage. 6% are hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And as I said, hypertrophic, you need to look at the heart. You need to do microscopic examination of the heart as well. You need to look down a microscope, and that is why we needed a microscope as part of our original grant to be able to make a diagnosis. You cannot just look at a heart and make a diagnosis. You need to take small pieces of tissue and look down a microscope and make diagnosis. And we made the diagnosis. We've gone on to further work with one of our clinical fellows, again a CRI fellow, Gerardo Finocchiario, who has looked at the circumstances of sudden death in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and recently published on this. And it shows young males die suddenly with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And it's the largest cohort of sudden death, so we can look very detailed and look. What is interesting, the fascinating and tragic thing about this is only 20%. 1 in 5 were diagnosed during life. The other 4 were only diagnosed with sudden death. That they presented the first event in the family was a tragic sudden death within that family. So highlighting that we need ECG screening, national screening, all this comes into view when you look at the fact they're undiagnosed, and hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, as my clinical colleagues will tell you, can be diagnosed easily during life. So the needs for further improvement of our understanding of the risk factors and mechanisms of sudden death and hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Going quickly on to idiopathic left ventricular hypertrophy. This is very similar to hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. The heart muscle is thickened, but it lacks a feature which diagnoses hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. It's not hypertrophic. It's a new entity. And this is what's important. And in a recent study with Sanjay and with Michael, you can see here that sudden death in sports, that this entity has become very important. 42% of people dying in sports is due to sudden arrhythmic death. But you can see the second there in brown, 16%, is idiopathic left ventricular hypertrophy. whereas hokum is only 6%, whereas in America it is believed hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is the main cause of sudden death in athletes. That is not true in the United Kingdom. It's sudden adult death, and it's idiopathic left ventricular hypertrophy. And the interesting point in these athletes, from the younger athletes where arrhythmias or channelopathies and the sudden adult death predominates, as one gets older as an athlete, the cardiomyopathies become more manifest. So in other words, the phenotype of cardiomyopathies manifests as you get older, maybe with exercise, that the phenotype comes out, or the damage in the heart due to exercise. And what is idiopathic hypertrophy? We simply do not know, but Michael Papadakis will talk further about what this entity and what research we have done on it. Finally, going on to arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy. This is quite difficult to diagnose in life and also at autopsy. And 13% of our athletes died of arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy. And now, in my clinical experience, I get one case at least a month. And the majority are dying during exertion and during exercise. And again, arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy manifests more. There's only 4% in the younger age group, but as one gets older, more arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy develops. Going on again, arrhythmogenic, 300 case, our most recent publication here with Chris Miles, also a clinical fellow, 300, the largest data of arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy in the whole of the world, you could say, showing it used to be called arrhythmogenic right ventricular cardiomyopathy, but now we call it arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy because both ventricles are involved. The left ventricle involvement is in the majority of people who die suddenly with arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy. You need pathology. You need to look down a microscope to diagnose it. You cannot just look at a heart and diagnose it. And left ventricular variants may evade clinical detection. In other words, clinicians need to be and alter their guidelines, looking not just the right ventricle, but also the left ventricle. This is the message coming from this recent publication in JACC. And going on finally to the final, which is idiopathic fibrosis. This is where idiopathic means we don't know. Fibrosis means the myocytes are brown, but in between is collagen and scarring. So with this, we don't know what's damaging the heart. We're looking into trying to find out. This is my criteria for diagnosing pathologically. And this is important. We need to help with guidelines. Looking at the coronary arteries is important. We've published on anomalous coronary arteries as well. We've also published on trauma to the chest causing sudden death, maternal deaths, tragically women dying suddenly while pregnant. And also aortic aneurysms can be genetic as well. Finally, the importance of specialist cardiac examination is highlighted by this paper that we published, showing that where it was published as arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy by the pathologist who referred it on, I found it to be normal. Pathologists overdiagnose cardiomyopathies. They can also underdiagnose them. So we need all to get together to train pathologists in improving our guidelines for diagnosis. The same with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, it can be misdiagnosed, and left ventricular hypertrophy, and even myocarditis or inflammation can be overcalled by pathologists. And even valve disease can also be misinterpreted. So it's important to get a specialist opinion in the United Kingdom and throughout the world on these entities, and to actually fine line our guidelines on each of these entities. I've published in the Bulletin of the Royal College of Pathologists emphasising about helping bereaved families with cardiac pathology. I run a cardiac pathology course here at St. George's Hospital for pathologists. I work closely with the cardiologists and with coroners throughout the country. I attend inquests at least once a month. And here, thanks to my colleagues, Professor Sharma, Elijah Baer, Michael Papadakis, and all the fellows who've worked here at St. George's. Already Sabia has told you about the work that she has done and what others are doing. And that we all work together, and here promoting the younger generation of fellows of Chris Miles, Joe Westerby and Gerardo Finocchiario. And it is CRY that is funding all this work. So I thank you very much, because without your funding, without it, we would not be here speaking to you today. Thank you very much.